Hey everybody. Sorry that I am a little bit late. I never did a recording yesterday. I've been working on the yearbook a ton with Mrs. Weatherby. We're trying to get it finished so we can have that all set for you guys. So it's awful out today. It was so nice this morning, and now it's terrible. So I'm not sure if you can hear the rain pounding on my window or outside my house. So let's do a quick review. I don't know how this is going to go. I don't have a good setup today. I apologize. So, chapter 16, when you read, if you remember, it was right at the end of 15 when Ruth had her seizure in front of Mrs. or Madame Lockton. And so, in the beginning of chapter 16, Isabel is trying to get Ruth settled for bed and makes the decision that she's going to try to find the note that Madame Lockton created with like gold buttons and that whole crew. So she sneaks up to his library. She is successful in finding it. He titles it the Committee to Preserve the King's Peace. And the note is about the fact that they have a plan to kill General George Washington. So Isabel sneaks into town. She wants to be able to find Colonel Reagan. It does not go well when she gets there. There's a bit of a commotion, but with her in being so insistent on seeing the colonel, she is able to actually get in there, and she explains to them that, shows them the note and explains to him that the plan is to kill General George Washington. Colonel Reagan asks her to put the note back in Master Lockton's desk, and then also gives her a password should she have to be let into camp again. And the password is ad astra, and ad astra is Latin, and it means Latin for to the stars. So she leaves, she gets back, she's able to put the note back. In chapter 17, Mr. Goldbuttons shows up at the Locktons, and he's very agitated, upset, and is demanding to see Mr. Lockton. And that's when he shares that the plot to kill Washington has been uncovered. Lockton's upset, Madam's upset. Lockton shares that they have to burn all of his papers and that he needs to leave. He admits to his wife that he's guilty. Madam wants him to stay and defend their name and their honor. She doesn't take it well. If you remember, she throws there's like a china jar on his desk, and she throws it at him. And unfortunately, we've seen a bit of a violent side with Mr. Lockton, and he strikes Madam Lockton with significant force, and makes it very clear to her that she is to stay at the house and continue to burn papers. A large crate arrives. The crate is labeled cheese, and Mr. Lockton actually hides in it, and they take him out of the house in the crate. When the soldiers arrive, the crate is gone, and all the papers are ash, and the soldiers are very angry. So once again, Isabel has shared this information, and they're not getting what they expect to get when the soldiers arrive at the house. In chapter 18, that's when we have it's kind of sad that they refer to it as like the excitement, to watch the hanging of Thomas Hickey. Thomas Hickey was the man who almost assassinated General George Washington. Becky encourages Isabel to go. She's really surprised by like the atmosphere. She almost describes that it's almost like she expects it to be like almost like a fair is happening, when in fact it's a man is going to lose his life, which is very, very sad, regardless of the fact that he, what he did was also wrong. So while they're waiting for the event to happen, they run into Curzon. Isabel expresses that she's hoping to see Colonel Reagan. Curzon tells her that she won't. It's just not going to happen, and that she has to continue to be patient. So now they bring Hickey out to the crowd. He's crying. Curzon thinks it's great. He responds good. He should be. People in the crowd are yelling. They're throwing food at him. And right before the hanging occurs, Isabel is able to quickly cover Ruth's eyes and close her own so they don't actually witness his death, his actual death. And then in chapter 19, if you recall, they're in church. It's very warm, and all of a sudden a young boy runs in and expresses that the British have sailed into the harbor. So there's a commotion. Everybody runs out of church. Isabel's wondering if they can possibly escape. She's hoping, but that doesn't happen. And then, unfortunately, as they're trying to get back to the house, Ruth suffers a mild episode or epileptic episode, and Isabel is a mess, but she's able to kind of keep it under control. Madame Lockton definitely is expressing that she feels like she knows something's wrong, showing no concern for Ruth. But Lady Seymour is actually very concerned, and once again is very kind and compassionate towards Ruth and to Isabel. At the very end of the chapter, Ruth and Isabel are outside washing linens, and Isabel realizes that Madame Lockton has been watching them, and ends the chapter by saying that she knows that they must escape soon. So things are definitely heating up a little bit more. So we are on chapter 20, starting 20. So again, I'll go through the primary sources to introduce the chapter. Chapter 20, Tuesday, July 2nd to Tuesday, July 9th, 1776. The Congress have judged it necessary to dissolve the connection between Great Britain and the American colonies and to declare them free and independent states, as you will perceive by the enclosed declaration. I am directed to request you have it proclaimed at the head of the army in the way you shall think most proper. And this was a letter from John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, to General George Washington. That week unspooled slowly with hot days and muggy, breathless nights. Militia units from the surrounding colonies piled into the city. Ordinary folk skedaddled out of it as fast as their horse or feet would carry them. The extra soldiers were not the cleanest sort, or maybe they were too busy drilling and making gunpowder cartridges to wash. Whatever the cause, New York soon smelled like a garbage pit mixed with a fresh mountain of manure. The stench cooked under the midsummer sun. Madame's moods changed with the tide. One moment she floated on clouds of fancy, imagining her grand life once the British beat the rebels. Next, she fell into melancholy grumbling about the lazy British commanders floating at anchor off Staten Island, observing New York through long spyglasses but making no move to invade. She now carried with her a brocade pouch suspended from a red satin cord. Within the pouch lay a green flask filled with a calming elixir prescribed by the doctor. He advised her to drink from it whenever the need arose. She also took to walking around the house in her stocking feet, trying to catch me unawares as I scrubbed or dusted or polished, often with Ruth at my side. She said nothing during these encounters, but watched us with hungry hawk eyes. It unnerved me. The week after Hickey's hanging, Becky suffered a mild attack of the ague that had befallen so many soldiers. She grew pale and sweaty, but did not require purging or leeches. In her stead, I went to the market. Our needs were fewer now that we no longer fed the master and his companions. 'Twas a good thing, for farmers were feared to come into the city, and there was less to choose from. More people fled every day, including the wives of General Washington and Colonel Knox and Brigadier Greene, her that folks said was such a big flirt. I searched for Curzon every day, but Bellingham's affairs kept him out of sight. I was afraid to seek out Colonel Reagan, afraid that word would get back to Madam and our lives to be put in jeopardy. 10 days after the British flooded the river with their ships, news that the Congress had declared independence arrived in New York. The declaration was read to the troops from the steps of City Hall. The men cheered so loud it seemed to shake the whole island. I hurried from the egg cellar to see the cause of the commotion. The cheering men danced and marched down Broadway, tossing their hats into the air and shouting across the river at the silent ships of England. They gathered into a mob on the Bowling Green around the massive statue of King George III. I stayed at the edge of the crowd hoping for a glimpse of Curzon or a soldier familiar from my visit to the Battery. The king was mounted on his horse, and the horse mounted on a white marble pedestal that rose to the height of 3 men standing one atop the other. Both the horse and the man were fastened larger than could be possible, but I suppose that was the way of kings. They were both made of gold that sometimes glittered in the sunlight but dulled when the clouds interfered. Ropes appeared as if conjured, thick ropes used for tying ships to the docks. The men cheered louder and worked together to throw the ropes over the king and his horse and tie them tightly. 1, 2, 3, heave! 1, 2, 3, heave! The men strained their arms and backs. Boys on the edge of the crowd jumped up and down. Common folk stood froze at the sight of a king being pulled down by the strength of the men working together. 1, 2, 3, heave! The statue toppled, slowly at first, then gaining speed as the weight fell from the sky to the ground. The men scrambled out of the way, no one wishing to be crushed by a fallen king. As it crashed, they shouted even louder and swarmed over the thing. Axes were called for and rushed out of workshops and up from the barracks. A half-dozen men took to chopping the king and his steed to bits. I inched closer. How could they be chopping through a statue with simple axes? A piece of tail broke off, and a soldier held it up for all to see. The king was not made of gold, but of soft lead covered with gilt paint. The crowd shouted again as another soldier lifted the king's head freshly removed from his neck. A fife and drum corps started playing just beyond the mob, piping out the song usually heard during a tar and feathering party. The men made short work of King George. When the statue was reduced into pieces that could be easily carted off, they did just that. The plan was to melt down all the lead into bullets. "We'll fire Majesty at the redcoats," joked a man with a booming voice. "Aye," said his companion, shouldering an axe. "Emanations from Leaden George will make deep impressions on the enemy." As the crowd marched off to make bullets and celebrate liberty and independence in the taverns, I realized dark was fast falling and I had tarried overly long. I picked up a sliver of lead that lay in the street. It was fringed with gilt, my own piece of Majesty. Tyrants beware, I thought, as I put it in my pocket. I was surprised to see the front parlor windows alight when I walked down Wall Street. "Is the master back?" I asked Becky. She was dozing in the chair by the kitchen fire with a red checked shawl around her shoulders, still worn down from her illness. Becky yawned and stretched. "Far from it. Madam paid a call on the Reverend's wife after supper, came home with high color in her cheeks and a bee in her bonnet. Dress the child, she says, make sure both the girls eat something nourishing and sweet." "Did she fall and hit her head?" I asked, setting down the basket of eggs. Becky laughed. "I think the Mrs. Reverend served her a dose of scripture, the hard kind, Madam says. I've been too harsh on my servants. I must mend my ways or the Lord will punish me." I was confuddled. "She's being kind to Ruth again?" Becky stood slowly, wincing from the aches in her bones. "Surely so." Ruth lit up like a lantern when she saw them fancy clothes again. Promised to be quiet as ever, make short work of the gingerbread Madam baked too. That was too much. I sat down at the table. "Madam baked." "She's a fair hand in the kitchen when she puts her mind to it. Left the dishes for yours truly, but the cake was tasty. Those 2 pieces are for you." She was most firm about it. She stopped to cough up what sounded like a large wet worm from her throat. "She cooked up sweet milk for you, too, with nutmeg, cinnamon, and sugar. Said you was to have some with your gingerbread." I sniffed the pitcher. It smelled good enough. "Did you have any?" "Not with this cough. Milk would stop up my lungs." I looked around the kitchen. "Where's Ruth now?" Becky unpinned her apron and folded it, then tied on her bonnet, preparing to go home. Madam got it in her head to play cards this eve. Has 2 companions in with her, the Mrs. Drinkwater and her daughter, the one who's to marry some sort of lord or duke or some such. Ruth is in with them. She was right cheered after the cake and milk. Should I take anything in? I just come from there. Madam was most definite. Tell Sal to enjoy her cake and a night off. She has worked hard these weeks and could do with a good night's sleep. She called me Sal instead of girl, I asked, and you are full certain she didn't hit her head today. Becky laughed, and the laughs caught in her throat and bubbled into a cough. Look here, she's likely to turn back into a sour old cow by breakfast, so I say have a good sit down and enjoy a little peace. I poured a mug of the milk. Huzzah for the Reverend's wife. I wanted to savor the gingerbread bite by bite and sip the milk slowly, but I couldn't help myself. The mug was drained and the plate emptied. Soon after Becky left, the milk was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted, the spices so thick I could near chew them. No wonder Ruth was cheered by it. I washed up my dishes, tidied the kitchen, and found myself with idle hands. A rare event indeed. I could sneak into the library and borrow that Crusoe book. I could read by the fire with a mending basket nearby to slip the book into should Madam approach. That seemed a fine plan, but first I wanted to shed my bodice. It pinched something awful under my arms. I felt my way down the cellar stairs with my toes and heard the sound of laughter from Madam's company. I yawned. When would they leave, and what sort of ladies came to call this late? I removed my bodice and hung it on a nail. The pallet looked soothing and cool, and the thought of climbing the stairs again made me wary. But I would like to read a few more pages. But I was overly fatigued. But Mr. Crusoe was facing all sorts of dangers. But in betwixt one thought and the next, I fell asleep. For that, I shall never forgive myself. Chapter 21, Wednesday, July 10th, 1776. To be sold at the office of William Tongue, broker, at the house of the late Mr. Waldron, near the Exchange, lower end of Broad Street. The following goods and merchandise: 1 Negro wench, 22 years old, has had smallpox, is a useful domestic, price $80. 1 Negro boy, 16 years old, price $90. 1 Negro wench, 30 years old, with or without her son, 5 years old, price $60 or $80. This was an advertisement in the New York Gazette and Weekly Mercury newspaper. In my dream, I stood on a sandy beach, my back to the sea, the moon over my left shoulder. An enormous map was unrolled at my feet. The roads on it were marked with velvet black ink, rivers a pearly blue, mountains a speckled green. It was a map of a country I'd never before seen. Just as I opened my mouth to call for Ruth, who always tagged along in my dreams, a thick mist blew over the beach. The roads on the map twined and twisted round each other, hesitating. Then they rose up off the paper. No longer roads, but thick eels with amber eyes. They crawled out of the map, and I feared they would bite me. They pondered me a moment, then slithered down the beach and into the water. I awoke with a start and flung aside the blanket, looking for the eels. There were none, nor in the potato bin. Ruth wasn't there neither, and her side of the pallet was cold. She was gone to the privy, no doubt. I needed to visit the same place. The sun was already in the trees when I stepped outside. How had I slept so late? Ruth, I called, walking toward the little building. My nose wrinkled. The Locktons would soon need to dig a new privy hole. Ruth! I knocked on the door and it swung open. The seat was empty, with a few flies buzzing in the stench. 2 blue jays in the sycamore tree called loudly. There was the distant sound of officers shouting orders on Broadway and the clatter of cartwheels. But no Ruth. I made quick work of looking in the yard. The back entry to the stables were locked. She could not have gone out that way. The gate to the street was closed too, and the latch too high for Ruth to reach. Had Madam already dressed her, taken her on a call? A thought slid through me, quick and slimy as a cold eel. I ran for the kitchen. Becky! Becky! She came out of the pantry as I flew through the door. Where's Ruth? Oh. Becky looked down at the worn tips of her shoes, then turned away from me. Her eyes were puddled up and red-rimmed. I can't find her, I said. She was gone when I woke. Have you seen her? Becky took a jar of flour down from the shelf. You know where she is, don't you? She removed the lid and stuck the scoop into the flour. Tell me! Becky shook her head from side to side. I should have started this bread earlier, she said, pouring the flour into the bowl. The wet air will ruin the loaves, that's my concern. I should have stayed and baked in the cool of the night. She dabbed her eyes on her sleeve and measured out another scoop of flour. But Madam sent me home, said she wanted a quiet house last night, no baking. She looked at me over her shoulder. The eel squeezed out all my air. No, I said. I wouldn't have gone if I had known. No, no, no. I backed away, shaking my head. She didn't. She wouldn't. No. Isabel, don't. Becky followed me down the hall, trying to control her voice. It won't change anything. What's done is done. Ruth! I screamed up the staircase. Stop, Isabel. Becky grabbed my arm and pulled me backward, clamping a flour-covered hand over my mouth. You can't storm around here like a banshee. Madam will beat you bloody, me too. I pushed her hand away and wiped off the flour. Where is she? What did they do to her? She's gone, Becky said. Gone? I repeated. Gone where? Becky studied her shoes again. Sold. I stopped hearing right. No birds or buzzing flies or grandfather clock making time. Sold? I repeated. No, she's not. They didn't. Becky's eyes filled again. Yes, she said quietly, she did. I paced the hall. No, I slept too heavy last night. Didn't notice when she woke. She wandered outside. We need to find her. She could be lost. Could have taken ill and fallen. Becky watched me go to and fro. The sweet milk Madam made up. I figured it contained a sleep potion. Knocked you out cold so they could spirit her away. I am dreadful, powerful sorry, but they sold her away from you. It made no sense. I would have known. I would have woken up, fought them off, killed whoever tried to take her from me. I took care of Ruth. I promised Mama I always would. Becky's face shrank down to the size of a coin. It sounded like she spoke through a long wooden pipe. Madam was returning in the carriage when I arrived this morn, she said, told me not to worry about the milk spoiling no more, that Ruth was headed to Nevis, sold to a physician's family. I shook my head, trying to clear my brain pan. Where's Nevis? How do I get there? Becky's face grew larger. You need to sit down. I'll get a cloth for your head. This has been a right shock to you. Where's Nevis? My voice echoed off the walls. West Indies? Becky muttered. The islands? All of Mama's terrible stories of slave life in the islands flooded back. Ruth can't cut cane. She'll die. She'll die in a day. My feet started for the front door. Wait! Becky grabbed my arm to prevent me from running off. I questioned Madam about that very fact, questioned her right close. I did, not to cut cane, said she, but to be a housemaid in a fine house, a physician's house, so they'll care for her should she fall. She's lying, I said. She's a spiteful, hateful liar. A door opened on the second floor. Becky, Madam asked, has someone come to call? No, ma'am, Becky said in a false high voice. Madam came down the stairs, one hand on the railing, the other holding a sheet of paper half covered with writing. The paintings of her dead ancestors on the wall watched her. I do not appreciate interruptions when I am communicating with my husband, she said. What is the matter here? Nothing, ma'am, Becky stuttered. I was given the girl her directions in the morning. Madam looked down without seeing me. She looked at my face, my kerchief, my shift neatly tucked into my skirt, looked at my shoes pinching my feet, looked at my hands that were stronger than hers. She did not look into my eyes. She did not see the lion inside. She did not see the me of me, the Isabel. I saw her. I saw all the way down to her withered soul. I walked up 2 steps. Did you sell Ruth? You will not address me in that insolent manner. Her voice shook a little. Becky wrung her hands. Come, Isabel, you need to peel the potatoes. Would Mama like some tea? Madam like some tea or coffee? I took another step up. Answer me, you miserable cow. Did you sell my sister? Madam backed up a step. Her letter fluttered to the bottom of the stairs. Her ancestors hung silent. Stay away from me, she said. Get back to the kitchen. She is 5 years old. I rose another step. She is a baby, and you sold her away from me. She swallowed hard. Her hands quivered. I wanted to grab her by the hair and throw her down the stairs, throw her out a window, beat her face with my fists. I wanted her blood to splash the painting, soak the wall and the wooden stairs. Isabel, Becky warned. The sunlight coming through the window was rosy red. I took the next step. I was almost close enough to reach her. "Isabel," Becky tried again. "One more step and I can have you hung," Madam whispered. I held my breath. There was a click of metal on metal. Becky had opened the front door wide. A hot wind from the street rose up the stairs, fluttering our skirts and causing me to turn. Madam grabbed a painting from the wall and threw it down on my head. I raised my arm too late, and the frame crashed into me. The blow made me addlepated and weakened my knees. Madam ran upstairs, screaming like a house afire. Becky dragged me down the steps and shoved me toward the open door. "Run!" she screamed. I ran out the front door for the first time. People walking under the shade of the sycamores across the street paused at the sight of a slave running away from a mansion where a girl was screaming. A man called after me, "You there, girl!" I ran straight down wall, didn't worry about escaping notice of soldiers or strangers, just flew over the cobblestones as fast as I could. The red fog slowly rolled out of my mind. There were more shouts behind me, and people turning to stare at the cause of the commotion. I didn't dare take the time to turn around. Past City Hall, cross Broadway, I leapt over the remains of a sentry fire, bumped into a gray-bearded soldier wearing a homespun shirt, and startled a man carrying 2 live hens by the feet. One of the hens broke free in an explosion of feathers. The man shook his fist and called out for someone to stop me. I ducked down one street after another, trying to find a way to the river, but the army had erected barricades at the end of most of the roads to keep out the British. I was penned in. The shouts behind me grew louder and closer. I darted down an alley, turned blindly toward the right, and ran smack into the barrel chest of a giant. "Whoa, there, young filly," a deep voice boomed. "Don't want to go swimming in that river, do you?" I had run straight into a blacksmith. "Please, sir," I said. His enormous hands released me, and I looked over my shoulder. "Looking to get away from someone, I suspect," the blacksmith said. Behind him billowed the coal smoke from the forge. The air was filled with a hot tang of metal and sweat. "You're hurt, child," the blacksmith said. "In need of some help." I wanted to spill out my story and to trust he could advise me, but he was a stranger. They were all strangers, and Ruth was gone, and there was blood on my forehead from the painting Madam threw at me, and she was going to see me hung, and I'd never be able to rescue Ruth, and she would be all alone, and— "Tell them I went north," I gasped as I picked up my skirts and darted around the forge to the south. The blacksmith called after me, but his words were lost in the din of the soldiers and the sailors who cluttered my path. The wind off the river cooled my face and helped with my decision. I would turn myself over to the rebels. I had helped them fair and square. Now it was their time. We were all fighting for liberty. "Ad Astra!" I shouted. The words were not as magic as I hoped, but the door eventually opened. Colonel Reagan was sitting in a chair, a white cloth around his neck, his face covered with foamy soap, and his eyes closed. Behind him stood a barber, a slave, I assumed because of his African skin, with grizzled hair and an apron. On the table beside him stood a bowl of steaming water, a leather strop for blades, and a cup of lather with a brush in it. He turned the colonel's chin with one finger, then delicately shaved away a stripe of soap with a razor. "By your leave, sir," said the sentry. "I am busy," the colonel said, without opening his eyes. "The girl knew the password, insisted on seeing you," the sentry continued. The barber scraped off another stripe of soap and whiskers. "Take her to Jameson," the colonel said. "No," I said. The barber froze in mid-shave, and the colonel opened his eyes. "Please, sir, you must help me," I said quickly. As I once helped you. She sold my sister. Please, sir, I'll do anything. Just find Ruth. She's so small and—" The door behind us opened. 2 more sentries filed in, followed by Madam Lockton, breathing hard, and a tall gentleman I had not seen before. My sentry waved me farther into the room so that the newcomers might all fit. I worked my way toward an open window. "What is the meaning of this?" the colonel asked. Madam's voice cracked across the room. "Are you the man in charge?" The colonel sighed deeply, waved off the barber, and stood up, his face still half covered with soap. "Colonel Thomas Reagan at your service, ma'am." He bowed stiffly from the waist. "How can I be of service?" "You have stolen my property," Madam announced. "We have several clerks assigned to record civilian concern. My sergeant will show you. I will not speak with subordinates or grubby clerks. That chit of a girl belongs to me, Colonel. She has committed terrible crimes and must be punished. I demand you return her to me." The barber rinsed the razor in the water bowl. Regan looked from Madam to me and back again. "What did she do?" "She abused me most violently, sir." The colonel put out his hand and the barber placed a clean towel in it. "Yet it is the girl with blood on her face," the colonel said, wiping away the soap from his chin and eyes and cheeks. Madam's eyes narrowed. "Give her to me." The sentries shifted their boots on the floor. One cleared his throat. The gentleman who accompanied Madam stepped forward. "The law is quite clear on this matter, sir. None of us want to live in a world where servants rule their masters. Both the Parliament and the Congress give Madam Lockton rule over her slave." A flock of crows swooped past the window. A three-masted shift. A three-masted skiff, sails unfurled, pushed down the river. Ruth could be on it, or she was already at sea, in a dark hold with no candles. Who would feed her? Who would hold her when she shook? "The girl says you've sold her sister," Colonel Regan said. "Do you mean to purchase Sal for the army?" Madam asked. "I'm sure she'd make a passing fine washwoman. I shall expect full payment in cash." He handed the towel back to the barber. "A washwoman is the one thing I don't need right now. If you had any manservants capable of ditch digging, I'd be taking you up on the offer, but—" He paused and shook his head. I looked out the window again. One crow had come back. It landed on a carcass near the water's edge, a dead dog, or a rat. The crow pecked at the meat of the thing, snatched a pink strip in his beak, and tugged until the piece broke away. He beat his wings once, twice, and flew up in the air, high enough to catch a breeze that rode him out over the water. Another man had entered the room. The night of my first visit to the fort, he had worn his uniform coat over his nightshirt. Now his coat was properly buttoned and his breeches tucked into his boots. "Thomas, we cannot interfere," he said. "This girl is not our concern, and you are late. We dare not keep him waiting." I looked out the window at the carcass. "Please, sir," I said, in a quiet voice, "let me stay." Colonel Regan fastened his collar without looking at me. "The law binds my hands and my actions. You must return with your mistress," he said, concentrating on his task. "Even during time of war we must follow the rules of propriety, and civilization." With that, the matter was concluded. Madam turned to thank the man who aided her. The sentry slipped into the hall. Colonel Regan picked up his hat from the table and set it on his head. As I stepped toward the window, the barber studied me close. He shook his head once from side to side, just as Jenny had back in Rhode Island 100 years ago. Bad advice on both occasions. I bolted for the open window. I almost made it.